Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our last 2019-2020 webinar from CERENA. I would like to welcome all the speakers, Lurdes Dinis, Paula Albuquerque and Manuel Ribeiro, and to Professor Orquidia. We'll be sharing this session. Professor Orquidia,
Thank you, Susanna. Hello, good afternoon or good morning to everyone. Welcome, as Susanna said, welcome to the last CERENA webinar, today related to public health. I'm Orquidia Neves, I'm the chair of this section that today is linked to the third Sustainable Development Goal that aims to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Public health is an interdisciplinary field that is concerned with protect and also improve people's health, protect, for example, from environmental threats, as air pollution or even radiation, or improve, for example, workplace conditions. This can be achieved, for example, by identify and investigate health problems and hazards, research new insights, new tools, and innovative solutions to prevent and solve disease and health problems. Inform and educate about health issues, also enforce laws and regulations that protect health and ensure safety, and also develop policies and plans that support individual and communities' health. At CERENA, we have several research that develop work in public health as our invited speakers, as Susanna said, that are Lurdes Dinis, Manuel Ribeiro and Paula Albuquerque. And to them, my thanks for accepting these invitations and to be here and share with us their knowledge and research. Also, before we start, I remind you that during these presentations or at the end of each presentation, you can, the audience, you can send your questions for the speakers, writing them on YouTube chat. For be easier, they will be answered at the end of the last presentation. So it's time to start with the presentations. And the first speaker is Lurdes Dinis. Welcome, Lurdes. Lurdes is a researcher of CERENA-FEUP and is also an associate professor with habilitation at Faculdade de Engenharia do Porto. His research being focused on mining and environment as environmental mining impact, remediation technologies, modeling of environmental process, natural radiation, and environmental and radiological protection. Our presentation today is about radioactive element, the radon, and is about exposure to radon gas. So, Lurdes Dinis, welcome, and when you are ready, you can start and share your screen, please.
So thank you, Orquidia, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. As Orquidia introduced me, I'm with the Faculty of Engineering from Porto University and also a researcher at CERENA. And my talk today is related with a very sensitive topic, which is the radon exposure and the causes and effects on human health. We have been working on natural radiation exposure for several years now. And lately, our studies focus on the exposure to radon in very particular environments. And this has been developed along with studies in general houses, schools, and kindergartens, finding renewed concerns about increased exposure to radon in these environments. These are some news that were released in 2012, 2015, 2017, alerting for the high levels of radon that were found in common buildings such as schools and kindergartens. So this leads us to a question about what is radon, where does it come from, why it can be so harmful. In fact, it's a natural radioactive gas. You can taste it, you can smell it, you can see it, but it is present in several rocks, soil, and even water with different amounts. Granite and volcanic soils, but also alumino shales are more likely to contain radon, but it also can be found in drinking water supplies. It results from the decay of radium-226, which is in its turn a decay product of the uranium-238 decay chain. It has a half-life of almost 4 days, which means that its concentration will decrease to half after this period of time. When it decays, when radon decays, it emits half particles, and these are solid particles and are the most dangerous and responsible for the DNA damage. The main problem comes when it concentrates in enclosed space, like underground mines or houses, in particular basements. It's responsible for most of the hazard by inhalation and is just the major contributor to the exposure to natural radiation received by the general population. So why is radon of concern? Mainly because of the decay products, which are solid particles, and in fact, radon and the decay products are breath-in, but only radon is exhale, as it is a gas. The solid particles will remain inside the respiratory tract, and they will be continuously emitting half particles, which are highly energetic and responsible for the damage to the cells. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 22,000 deaths a year occur due to the radon exposure. And epidemiological studies also confirm that indoor radon at homes can increase the risk of lung cancer in the general population. It's considered the second most important cause of this type of cancer after smoking. And the combined effects of radon and smoking are particularly dangerous. When it concerns to the mortality rates from this type of cancer, the worst mortality of lung cancer is much higher than any other type of cancer. Also, in 2017, about 2 million people all over the world died due to tracheal, bronchus, and lung cancer. And in Portugal, with records from 2009, the 5-year survival rate due to this type of cancer was nearly 13%. So how can we be exposed to this radioactive gas? Us, the general population, we are likely exposed at homes, in the indoor environments. But there are also several workplaces where this exposure can also occur. And in the past, this was not considered as occupational exposure because it was natural. There was nothing to do about it, or because it was natural, it couldn't harm you. However, the exposure can occur in mines, independent of the mine substance, in hydrotherapy treatment rooms, in underground workplaces such as caves and galleries, and also in some types of industries, such as the norm industry, naturally occurring radioactive materials, and such as extraction of gas and oil in the phosphate industry, and so on. There are some particularities about the variation of radon levels. First, it will depend on the geographical location, and this is related with the geological setting, the type of construction, the type of mechanical system, because if there is ventilation, if it is mechanical ventilation or natural ventilation, the time of the day, usually the indoor levels are higher during the night, the weather conditions, because it is affected by the humidity, the occupational lifestyle, if the individual has as an habit to ventilate the room, open the windows or other type of ventilation, the time of the year, because there are, in fact, seasonal change. Usually during the winter, the levels are higher, and other unknown or unidentified factors. This is just a funny cartoon where it's illustrates that the house is guaranteed 100% radon-free as long as not in contact with the ground. Radon can also appear in water, although almost of the exposure will be through the inhalation of the radon present in indoor air. 1% is attributed to water sources, but even though this exposure comes from the radon that is released from running water activities, such as bathing or showering, a very small fraction is considered to be from the exposure in drinking water with radon. And although it's not a consensus, it suggests that the majority of this radiation dose will affect the stomach. It occurs primarily in groundwater, not in surface waters, because it's a volatile gas, so it will dilute or disseminate in the air. But when it appears in groundwater, the concentration can vary through a wide range of values. It can go from 1 to 10,000 becquerel per liter, depending on the geology of the setting, mainly if there is uranium mineralizations or other type of mineralizations, and also on the circulation of the water. Since the 80s, there have been several studies directly investigating this relation between the indoor exposure and the increase of the risk in lung cancer in general population. And individually, these studies are too small to allow to estimate a risk or even to provide a clear evidence of this relation. Therefore, the major studies in Europe, North America, China were brought together and they were reanalyzed. And as soon as the data was pulled together, a very similar picture for the risk emerged, associating the increased risk of this type of cancer from the indoor exposure to radon. Also, an overwhelming evidence showing that this exposure caused a considerable number of lung cancers in general population, and it also allowed to estimate the magnitude of the risk. It also shows a very important detail, which is not a detail actually, that this increased risk cannot be excluded even for levels below 200 becquerel per cubic meter, which is the radon action level in many countries. And I will later in a few slides to explain what is the meaning of this action level. At the same time, a review of the 11 studies of underground miners exposed to radon that were available in the 90s were brought together and analyzed by the Committee of the Biological Exposure to Ionizing Radiation. And these 11 studies comprise 60,000 miners in Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia, among whom 2,600 deaths occur from lung cancer. 8 studies refer to uranium miners and 3 studies to miners of tin, fluorspar, or iron. In all these studies, the lung cancer rate increased linearly with increasing cumulative rate exposure. But in one study, this rate increased the moderate exposure and then decreased again at high exposure, which is somehow contradictory. And despite the high variation of the magnitude of the risk that was evident from the different studies, the committee decided to analyze the pooled data from all 11 studies, giving different weights to each one of the studies. And the results show that the cancer death rate per working level months, and this working level months means the cumulative exposure of an individual over a working month of 170 hours. It was shown that this rate varied time since exposure, being higher in the period between 5 and 14 years after exposure. It also varied the age of the exposed person, being higher at younger ages. And another finding of the committee was that miners exposed at low concentrations presented a higher increase in this death rate than miners exposed at higher concentrations. Another contradictory result. So when extrapolating the results from the studies with miners to the general population, it was clear this uncertainty. And if not for more, at least because of the miners are exposed to conditions which are very different from the conditions that people are exposed at homes. Miners are exposed to many other factors that can in fact contribute to increase this risk. Therefore, this uncertainty was avoided by taking case control studies from 13 European studies, 7 North American studies, and 2 Chinese studies. And the analysis consists in collating and comparing this individual information from these studies. So from the European pooling study, there were more than 7,000 lung cancers, more than 14,000 case control studies, and a clear positive association emerged, as I said before, even for levels below 200 becquerel per cubic meter. The risk increased by 8% per each 100 becquerel per cubic meter in radon concentration. This risk did not vary with age, sex, or smoking history, more than would be expected by chance. The dose response was linear, which means there is no threshold below which there is no risk. And this is quite important because the small dose, the small exposure has some risk. And this risk was 20% higher in individuals with a measured concentration between 100 and 199 becquerel per cubic meter when compared to those exposed levels below 100 becquerel per cubic meter. From the North American study, 7 studies were brought together with more than 300-600 lung cancer cases, nearly 5,000 case control studies, and an increase of 11% of the risk. Again, this value did not change with age, sex, or smoking history. From the last pooling study that reached two areas in China, there were more than 1,000 lung cancers, nearly 2,000 case control studies, and an increase of 13% in the risk. And the results were consistent with the linear dose response with no threshold. So in what concerns to other disease besides lung cancer that may be caused by radon exposure, it's clear that the highest dose will go to the bronchial epithelium, but also other organs may receive low doses, such as kidney and bone marrow. It's not, there's no strong evidence that drinking water with radon will cause any other type of cancers. However, a positive association was found for radon exposure and leukemia and lymphoma in a study with Czech uranium miners. So as I said before, to understand this value of 200 and to frame this level into legal frameworks, it's necessary to define, or at least to give some definition about the action level. And it's not a boundary between safe and unsafe, although many people think this way. It's the level at which actions will be required to reduce the radon levels at home. In many countries, this value is 200 becquerel per cubic meter, and above this value, mitigation measures should be taken to reduce these levels. WHO recommends that the action level should be kept below 100 becquerel per cubic meter whenever it's possible. The National Commission on Radiological Protection and the same from the European Union with the Directive 59 from the Euratom, this action level is stated in 300 becquerel per cubic meter. In what concerns to radon present in water, the action level is 1,000 becquerel per liter, and this value was set that the risk to a typical person drinking water with this concentration is similar to the risk from breathing air containing 200 becquerel per cubic meter. And again, this is not a limit between safe and unsafe. This 1,000 becquerel per liter means that at this level, action should be taken with no further consideration to reduce the radon concentration. There is no reference value for radon in thermal mineral waters. Then this is because it's assumed that these are not consumed on a regular basis, and therefore the risk is not significant or not to be considerable. Just a last highlight about this action level. In the United States, there is no action level, there is a maximum contaminant level, and this value is 150 becquerel per liter. And this refers to radon concentration in drinking water from private water supplies, such as private wells. So this leads us to the last part of this presentation, which refers to case studies. The first one was a study to assess the radon in indoor air and also in thermal mineral water from thermal spas. It was developed between 2012 and 2016 with a PhD student. And just to frame this particular environment, which is an occupation, which can translate an occupation exposure, the European Directive number 29 from 96 identifies hydrotherapy as a professional activity with potential to occupational exposure, and this addresses, of course, workers and through the inhalation of radon. It also says that each member state shall identify the work activities where a significant increase in the exposure due to natural radiation sources may occur, and this includes in particular thermal spas where thorium, radon doctors or gamma radiation may be present. And in this context, several surveys and studies have been conducted all over the world in recent years, from Africa to South America to the Balkans, China, and even, of course, in Europe, in Portugal including. And these studies consisted in assessing the radon concentration in thermal spas, both in air and water, to give an estimative of the exposure doses. And the results are quite interesting, but because for the majority of these studies, the radon concentration can reach very concerning levels. Just a summary of the results from the several studies that were taken worldwide, approaching thermal springs and hydrotherapy treatment rooms. The indoor radon ranged between 0.7 and 19 kilobecquerel per cubic meter, and in thermal water between 2 and 94 kilobecquerel per liter. The study that was developed in Portugal in 17 thermal spas. At the time, the total were nearly 38 active thermal spas. The indoor radon ranged between 73 and 400 and more than 4,000 becquerel per cubic meter, and in thermal water between 76 and nearly 7,000 becquerel per liter. Just to remember that the action level for the indoor radon is 300 becquerel per cubic meter, and in the water 1,000, although it does not apply to thermal water. So the other case study is this project, the Breeze Air, that was developed last year in a collaboration with several institutions, FEUP, Faculdade de Ciências da Universidade de Coimbra e Tecnologia da Universidade de Coimbra, Escola Superior de Saúde Pública e a Escola Nacional de Saúde Pública. And the purpose of this project was to assess the exposure of bathrooms and workers to bioburden, and this comprised fungi and bacteria, and the radiation burden in these particular environments, which are thermal spas. So the purpose was to evaluate continuously the indoor radon level through a continuous year. It took place between December 2018 and December 2019. And for this study, 3 thermal spas were selected, 2 of them with a similar geological setting, and 1 of them with a very different geological setting. A passive method was used for assess the indoor radon levels with this CR39 and with the full collaboration of Laboratory of Natural Radiation from Universidade de Coimbra. So besides the indoor radon concentration, gamma dose rates and total gamma radiation were also assessed in all locations from these facilities. And just a few results from the study. In the thermal spa number 1, comprising 2 buildings, all values for all locations were below 200 becquerel per cubic meter, which is so far so good. For number 2, it was the opposite situation. In all locations, or except this one, but for almost all locations, and through all the year, the results were much higher than 300 becquerel per cubic meter. And highest was registered at the inhalation therapy room with nearly 2,000 becquerel per cubic meter. And the numbers, the thermal span number 3, a similar situation in all locations. The results were much higher than 300, and the highest values were registered at the thermal pool with nearly 1,700 becquerel per cubic meter. So just to conclude, and 3 final remarks, it's clear that radon concentration in indoor air of these hydrotherapy rooms and thermal pools represent a very high exposure, and if it's a short-term impact for users, that cannot be won't be significant, but it's a long-term impact, or it has a long-term impact for workers because they are exposed for longer and continuous periods of time. Some of these workers have been there at the same workplace for the last 10 years. And this additional exposure is significant to this workers group, so the radon levels should be at least monitored, which are not, although all the change in the legislation and all the impact that has been, or all the attention that has been brought to in the last few years. Thank you.
Professora Orquídia está sem microfone.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Maria Lourdes, for your interesting presentation and complete presentation about radon that, as you show, in some places or in some condition could be also a threat to people health. Now I remind always the audience that you can send your questions to Maria Lourdes on YouTube chat. So we thank you, Maria Lourdes. We are now moving to the next presentation with Manuel Ribeiro. Hello, Manuel. Manuel is a research fellow at CERENA-IST and is an invited assistant professor at Instituto Superior Técnico. His main research interests are focused on spatial and temporal modeling tools applied to environmental epidemiology. His talk about spatial uncertainty in association between health and outdoor air pollution. So, Manuel, hello. Thank you for coming, for being here. When you are ready, you can start, please.
Hello. I'll just a minute. Ok.
Algum problema, Manuel?
Não, acho que já está. Ok. Já percebi. Estava aqui com uma dificuldade. Okay. Good morning, everybody. I will share my presentation now to share. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Orquidia, for inviting me for this session, this interesting session. I would like also to thank all the audience for being here in this last seminar about such an interesting topic, which is public health. Today it's a major topic everywhere in the world. So what I will talk today is about the research work that I'm doing that is well related with the targets set by the Agenda 2030. I will especially talk about two specific topics, two main topics that are in line with this agenda, which are modeling of air pollution exposure for population exposure assessment. So I will talk about environmental risk factor, which is air pollution, and I will also talk about the infectious disease, the progress of infectious disease, and in specific case of the COVID-19 mapping. This is an update because this work has been developed very rapidly as the pandemic appeared. So these are the two topics that I'll be talking in this presentation. I'll divide this in three sections: an introduction, ambient air pollution statistical modeling, and finally I'll talk about the infectious risk mapping by using the COVID-19 data. So looking at the 2030 agenda, I've spotted some targets that should be underlined here because they match exactly what we are doing in the research center. One of them is the end the progress of infectious diseases. This is one of the major aims, and these infectious diseases are mostly referred as tuberculosis, HIV, hepatitis, B and C, and of course SARS-CoV-2 must be in the agenda for starting now. It's not there yet, but it will be in the next short time, of course. And other target is to reduce the burden of non-communicable diseases, mental health and environmental risks. So the research that I am doing in CERENA is aligned with these two targets based on the following rationale. So we are combining methods from geosciences from one side, which is basically we are using the geostatistical methods, and on the side of public health we are dealing with methods that are applied by spatial epidemiology, or which is a subgroup of epidemiology science. For those who maybe not, I'm sorry if I'm saying something that everybody knows, but epidemiology studies the distribution of disease in time, space, and populations, and tries to study this disease in these terms to understand the etiology of disease and try to control their spread. So the methods they are applied in epidemiology can be matched with geostatistical tools to understand what is the role of space in this public health issues, and may provide new corridors, new ways of research that we are trying to explore. So how are we doing that? We're doing that by modeling. We have been working on the statistical modeling of ambient air pollution for population exposure assessments. And as I told in the beginning, we have recently started working on spatial and temporal progress of COVID-19 risk by developing some COVID-19 mapping infection rates. Okay. So I'll talk about these two topics. I'll start by population exposure assessments. What do we do? Actually, well, for exposure assessment, we may start by the beginning, which is using ground-based monitoring stations, which are basically used for assess the ambient air pollution that comes from these monitoring stations that are monitored by the National Environmental Agency. Here in figure 1, I just illustrate these ground-based stations. Each one is represented by 1 dot. The color represents a mean concentration that we observed for a specific period of time, for example, 1 month. And if we have this information on space, so we can infer what is occurring in all the rest of the area where we do not have information. We can use some kind of interpolation. So geostatistics has the tools to infer the spatial processes that are behind the data that we observe, and it has some tools to do that. Basically, we study the spatial autocorrelation of this data, and from there we may do some predictions and try to create a map that provides a mean image of what we see in the observed data. And geostatistical tools also have developed simulation algorithms based on stochastic sequential algorithms in order to assess uncertainty of these observed data. And this is really important in exposure assessment, because if we do not measure the uncertainty of exposure, the exposure assessment can be misleading. Okay, so based on this idea, this is the main rationale behind the use of geostatistical tools for exposure assessment, for population exposure assessment of ambient air pollution. And based on this, we can do some research that might provide relevant contributions for epidemiological studies. Besides using ground-based station data, we can use other auxiliary information which can be incorporated in geostatistical models to improve the accuracy of the exposure estimates. This is done by using some function of the auxiliary data that we add to our geostatistical model. And this has been our work in the last couple of years in order to provide more complete exposure assessment, more accurate exposure assessment, you can say so. So auxiliary data that we are trying to introduce in our air pollution models is based on satellite data, land use data, and climate and other climate variables like wind, precipitation, or air temperature. So this is not a trivial work, especially satellite data that is very recent to availability of this data is relatively recent, and it's not trivial to combine this satellite data from air pollution with ground-based stations. But however, we are working on that, and we'll be heading on that direction for the next few years at least, in order to provide new ways to get better more accurate population exposure assessment. Oops, sorry. So based on these main ideas, I'll just show you some of the work that we have been already doing in the past 5-10 years. This is basically modeling air pollution data for exposure assessment. We have done that in the study in the Alentejo littoral region to measure the associations between air quality and birth weight by doing a population exposure assessment of pregnant women living there. So for that, as I told you, we used simulation data to assess the uncertainty of exposure, and from there we proceeded with statistical analysis to measure the impacts on birth weight. This work was published, and is here referred if you would like to check the results and the methods in detail. We also have looked at a scale, a higher resolution scale. So we looked at an urban scale where air pollution or air pollution dynamics are more complex to model. There are chemical physical processes occurring at an urban in an urban area that are quite more difficult to model, and we are talking about statistical methods to do this. So to capture these variations using statistical methods, we had to incorporate some auxiliary variables, and we have done it using land use data in this other work that is also here indicated in the footnote. So based on this population exposure assessment, we were able to measure the impacts on population's health. as I told you, the outcome that we studied in these two previous slides, in these two previous studies, it was birth weight, and we measured how birth weight varies with the variations in air quality variations. What was the impact of air quality variations in the variations of birth weight? Sorry. So what kind of methods did we use? We used regression models in this case. Here I present two types of models that we have been applying. We started by applying just generalized linear models, which are regression models with linear predictors. And more recently, we have started using spatial generalized linear models. We are very similar. However, when we are looking at the local impacts, we are able to estimate a different association that is locally varying. So instead of looking at the global association between air pollution and birth weight, we look at local associations between air pollution and birth weight. So, but also this work was also published in 2018. So if you like more details or talk to me about it, so it's please be comfortable. But I just wanted here to refer that basically these two approaches incorporate exposure assessment. They incorporate spatial uncertainty of exposure assessment. As I told you, it's very important to take into account exposure uncertainty in this kind of studies. And to finalize that, this spatial regression approach, which is the second, was an improvement and extension of the first one, and I think it's had some better results in terms of knowledge that we can take from these studies. Now I'll go to the other side of the analysis. First, I talked about environmental risk factor. Now I'll talk about the disease outcome. But to show that with just statistical methods, we are also able to map disease with having some contributions for what exists in our days presently. So for COVID-19 infection risk maps, we have done some work already. It is already published. Here it's referred the reference. If you can see, it's an open access. You can see it and to understand the details. Anyway, what we have done with these maps was to create some high spatial resolution maps of infection risk, and we also assessed the spatial uncertainty of infection risk. So the rationale based on the geostatistics is similar. So we have some information about what occurs in each municipality. In this case, it's not ground-based stations. And based on what occurs in each municipality, we infer the spatial process that is behind this incidence rate that we observe. And from there, we can predict some continuous surface of this phenomena, and then we can create some simulations to assess the spatial uncertainty of this infection risk, and we do it with high resolution maps. So what was this needed for especially for mapping COVID? Well, for health authorities, it was a tool for tracking and combating infection spread for the first months especially, and it provides real-time information to support critical decision making. So what have we done in this research was we just collected the data that is referred here. Only we just have these two types of information. Well, we had more, but for the infection risk, now it's relevant just to talk about these two, which is the daily number of confirmed positive tested cases reported by health authorities, and we also had the exposure population based on the estimates of the resident population population available at the national statistics. So from there, we computed an incidence rate, which is given here by this formula. But in this formula, here we have the number of cases, and here we have the population that is exposed. One problem that may arise when we are looking at this indicator, at this incidence rate, is that when the number of the exposed population, here the denominator, is small, we have something that is called the small number problem, because this rate tends to be less reliable. So in an extreme example, if you have just one person living in one municipality, for example, if that person gets infected, you'll get a 100% incidence rate in that municipality. But that doesn't mean that the risk of being infected on that municipality is 100%. It shouldn't mean that. So incidence rate and risk tends to be much different when we have these small numbers in the denominator. So one thing that we tried to correct was that. For that, we applied the geostatistical methods based on the spatial autocorrelation of the data. For example, here we have 2020, 12th April 2020 incidence rates. And we may see that there's a trend to where locations with higher incidence are closer to each other, and the same with the low incidence municipalities. And we can translate this into a function that is shown here, that shows that the dependence of incidence rates between municipalities is relatively high. So it goes up to 45 kilometers range, meaning that incidence rates observed in any specific place tend to be related with incidence rates observed up to 45 kilometers distance. So we use using these tools, we were able to produce our infection risk maps that here I just bring a small example. First, we had to discretize our municipalities map. So Portugal was divided in municipalities, and from there we had to discretize these municipality areas in regular points in order to have high spatial resolution maps. And from there we used a variant of kriging that I showed you in the first slides, which is block kriging simulation. And with that, we were able to derive the simulations of the infection risk to assess the spatial uncertainty of local estimated risks. So we were able to, this is one example of a simulation. This is the median map of all simulations. So it's an attenuated, smoothed version of the risks. And here we have the uncertainty related using, here we use the interquartile range uncertainty risk map to present the results. For future, we hope to get more data to be able to improve our COVID maps by having more resolved COVID data, having information by sex, age, time of diagnosis, and time of getting recovered or getting dead. Mobility data, know where people are moving, if people are moving and where to, from where. Other social demographic variables, health variables to control the number of incidence cases using, for example, the number of tests for COVID-19. And maybe instead of studying only the incidence rate, maybe we can study other epidemiological indicators like prevalence or survival, because they should actually also have some sort of spatial structure in their occurrence. So I would like to thank you all for this hearing this work. I've been brief in the methods and in brief in the research done, but of course I'm open for receive your emails, and the research papers are also available for everybody. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, Manuel, can you stop? Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Manuel, for your very nice presentation about some application of the geostatistics tool to LD studies. And congratulations to you and your team for your recent COVID work, as well you know is a great and concerned public health. Yeah. Again, and one more time, I remember all to don't forget to send your questions to Maria Lurdes Dinis and to Manuel Ribeiro. And now we have the last presentation. The last speaker is Paula Albuquerque. Hello, Paula. Paula Albuquerque is a collaborator of SERENA and a coordinator professor in environmental health at Escola Superior de Tecnologia de Saúde, Lisboa. She is a former PhD student in environmental and occupational health. She develops work in the area of professional exposure to nanoparticles and environmental health. And today her talk is related to occupational exposure to welding fumes. So welcome, Paula. Feel free to start when you want.
Okay, thank you. Good morning or good afternoon to all the participants and colleagues of these SERENA seminars with an emphasis on public health issues. I would like to thank Professor Orquidia for the invitation that was addressed to me, and also to my advisor of PhD, Professor João Gomes, who integrate me into this research center. I would like to tell you a little bit about occupational exposure to welding fumes. This work fits on the goals of the Sustainable Development, third goal, namely 3.9. However, I will try to do my best because I feel like SpongeBob in this picture, and this will be a great challenge to me. Some contents of this presentation: introduction, objectives, methods, results, discussion, conclusions, and finally, future research. Occupational exposure to welding fumes could be the cause of several diseases related with the pulmonary system, as well as other, some of them carcinogenic. Occupational exposure occurs to the properties of the particles existing in fumes, like surface area, granularity, and chemical composition, the characteristics of exposure itself, intensity and direction, as well as other factors which are dependent from the workers themselves, individually susceptibility, and the interaction with other risk factors, namely tobacco. According to the mention, this is the starting point of the project. What is the professional exposure to nanoparticles and its effects on the workers from metalworking industry? Why is it considered an innovative study? Because it's the first developed in real work context. The use of equipment for advanced nanoparticle characterization technology, the three equipment in the picture, self-perceived exposure and complaints from workers, and finally the quantification of internal dose using biological indicators. Some of the objectives of the present study: we want to characterize professional exposure to nanoparticles in fusion welding process with the characterization of work environmental, also the health effects of workers, and finally quantifying internal exposure through biological exposure indicators. Some of the specific objectives: define a qualitative risk assessment methodology, identify and validate methods and equipment for monitoring nanoparticles, evaluate and characterize the most frequent nanoparticles in the different welding process, quantify respiratory symptoms or disease self-reported by the workers, and also validate a biological monitoring methodology from chromium and manganese for this professional group. The study design consists in a descriptive and exploratory study in a real working environmental from metalworking industry. It was intended to identify the occupational exposure to nanoparticles from welding process using an integrated methodology to perform environmental qualify with this tool and quantify with environmental monitoring by self-reference symptomatology, and finally quantify metal species of chromium and manganese as biological indicators of exposure. A specific tool for risk evaluation was used, control banding nano tool, and obtain qualitative data that are found to be relevant to understand the situation of the work environment. In what regards to the environmental monitoring, different equipment was used in order to obtain data like lung deposit surface area. It appears to be the most relevant physical metric for quantifying exposure to nanoparticles. This other equipment that measure the number of particles per size range, 10 to 420 nanometers, and number of concentration, and this one to collect in the sampling grinds the nanoparticles, and that will be allowed for future characterization. Some of the population and sample of this study, we choose 40 welders and 10 of the control group, but we call indirectly exposed group. Some of the results. In process 11, we can see in this graphic with 61 welding activity, we can see several peaks of numerical concentration of nanoparticles, which corresponds in terms of particle size 27.4 nanometers. In this picture, we see that the particles emitted in this process, the same process, P11, the particles are mostly nanoparticles. 92.5% of the particles are in the range 10 to 100 nanometers, and the rest in the upper range. Now, from this table, we can see that the lung surface area and the number of nanoparticles emitted during MEG and TIG welding process are significantly higher than the baseline. We see in green the baseline for the first year, and red the baseline for the second year. For particles with this size, 27.4 nanometers, it appears that the curves of the two equipments are practically overlapping. Particle morphology is mainly composed by, you can see here, for spherical agglomerated, and its elemental chemical composition comprise mainly iron, and chromium and manganese, which are present both in the base material and also in the film material of the welding process. An inquiry was applied to the groups directly exposed and indirectly exposed, involving a satisfactory participation of the workers. In this study, welders report a higher incidence of symptoms when compared, obviously, with the indirectly exposed. More frequently self-reference symptoms are cold, we can see in this table, and it persists along the day. In general, the results of biological indicators, chromium and manganese, from welders are below certain international limit values, you can see here, but significantly higher than the values found on general population. Workers from indirectly exposed, which are primarily considered as control group, are in fact exposed to welding fumes, as confirmed by the biological indicators of exposure. The existence of relationship between chromium and the number of the years working in the company in the indirectly exposed group was confirmed. And now we can see in this slide that there are significant difference between values of chromium between welders, they are exposed, and the group not exposed for the process P22 and the process carbon. This result suggests that welding process, MEG and TIG, can be the emission source of a significant amounts of nanoparticles. For the discussion, for the question one, what is the qualitative risk assessment metrics appropriate to this occupational context? We can say that control banding nanotool is a qualitative metrics based on the relationship between severity and probability to the time risk levels. The World Health Organization suggests the use of these risk assessment tools and to choosing measures to control exposure in the workplace. The results are consistent with risk level 3 and 4 and quantitative data. And these tools have a practical interest to the occupational health service. It can be used as simplified method of risk assessment. For question 2, what are the most appropriate methods and equipment for nanoparticles? The use of this equipment and experimental procedures provide very useful information for assessment of exposure as well risk assessment. For question 3, what is the nature, composition of and morphology of the most frequent nanoparticle in the welding process? We can say that 17 to 92.5% of the particles are in nanoscale. The 32 to 63 nanometers is the average size of the particles. That the surface area are between this range, with mean baseline with small values than the deposit length volume. They are distributed in clusters and are spherical. The composition is in accordance with the base and addition materials of the welding process. The question 4, which respiratory symptoms or disease are most self-reported by workers? we can say that welders reported higher incidence of symptoms when compared to non-welders. The most self-reported symptoms is symptoms during the day and night, but also nasal complaints, the values are very similar between the two groups. And for welders reported respiratory disease with medical discharge. The last question, what is the biological monitoring methodology for this professional group? In general, the levels of biological indicators, chromium and manganese, among welders indicate a low but a measurable occupational exposure. The biomonitoring strategies should be based on urine samples for the last day of the work week, end of the shift always, according to the laboratory protocols and based on the duration of retention of biological indicator, and the biological exposure indicator, chromium, was recommended qualitative metrics for monitoring exposure in welding activities. Some discussion for this data. The 4 data collection instruments show concordant results and reinforce the validity, allowing to infer the complementary of the methods. Control banding nanotool is an appropriate qualitative method and of interest for screening the assessment of risk in the workplace exposure to nanoparticles. The techniques used allow the quantification of nanoparticles and their characterization, and the process that releases the most nanoparticles is P11 and carbon, which corresponds to a large surface area per lung volume. There is a statistical relationship between the symptoms caused the rest of the day or night and symptom and biological indicator chromium. Also positive relationship between biological indicator chromium and the number of years in the company for the group indirectly exposed. The biomonitoring strategy based on urine samples post-shift and collect of the end of the work week are crucial for the characterization of exposure, and professional exposure was confirmed in workers in the both groups, directly and indirectly exposed. We can say that the concept of the workplace in this study is broader than the place of the emission. Has also found that other workers are exposed to the study methods. Some future research, monitoring of particles at the micro and nano scale, determining the share of each fraction. Future study on the health effects, both at level of the respiratory symptoms of workers, and harmonization of assessment methodologies in order to proceed comparable data between processes. Some of the publications of this project and reference, and many thanks to all my. And thank you, and sorry for my English.
Okay, thank you, Paula. Okay, thank you, Paula, also for your interesting presentation and the work related to the exposure to at workplace conditions is important naturally to reduce risks and health problems of the workers. Again, we are in the last presentation. We have time to have questions for Paula Albuquerque and other speakers. Please send your questions for the chat, because now we are in the time for the questions and discussion about this presentation and about these themes or topics. So let me see if there are any questions. I don't know very well
Yes, one question to Manel.
Okay. Okay. There is a.
I like a comment from
the comment for Manuel Ribeiro. You must explore predictions as you have covariates in your spatial temporal COVID-19 data analysis. Thank you. Thanks for the talk. I think is a comment, not a question. Yes.
Yeah, it's a comment, and it's an important one because in fact we have to include more variables that help to explain what is occurring in space and time for the COVID infection. We have that in mind. We will work on that in the near future. So it's a relevant question because in fact we are just, for the mapping that we have done, we just use the information that is provided by the national health authorities, which is only based on the number of cases per municipality, which gives us an idea, but we can do better if we have better information and more and better information. So that's a point that I also agree completely. We have to add more covariates in our models for the future, and I hope we'll do so.
Okay, I think we don't have questions yet. I can, for example,
no.
Susanna?
No more questions.
No more questions. Okay, you can, if any speaker want to put a question for the other colleague, feel free for do it also. And I can, for example, make a question for Manuel. I want to know what, your opinion, for example, what you think is the main challenge for geostatistics methods of tools for the analysis of health of epidemiological data. What do you think is the best challenge or the main challenge for just when you use these health data or epidemiologic data?
Well, there are lots of challenges actually. Geostatistical tools have the major advantage of them is that they are able to describe somehow, to model the way things are related in space and in time. And because health data, it tends to be related in space and time, what we observe near time space dimensions tends to be more similar than when health occurrences are far away in space time. I think just statistical tools can provide good tools to predict in space and time what it may occur. We do it very well in space. We also do it very well in time, but there are methodologically speaking, we might have improvements to do in terms of functions that are able to capture the spatial temporal dependence of health events. And I think they can contribute very much to health studies, especially epidemiological studies that are related with the environmental risk factors, or in this case, the last case I talked about, disease mapping. So environmental risk factors and disease mapping, I think there are two good targets for just statistical tools to help epidemiological studies to be more rich in terms of results.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if any of you have questions for the others. If you want to put some questions. No?
May I ask something to Paula? Did you consider to study other exposure agents in that kind of industry, in the welding industry? because we had a work a few years ago with non-ionizing radiation in the welding industry, and it was quite interesting.
No, next for the next project, maybe yes, but for this, no, sorry.
Okay, I can also pose a question to Paula.
Yes.
You talk about different methodologies. Can you tell me how important is the combination of these four methodologies in terms of occupational or public health?
Yes, I think the data obtained by the combine the four use methodologies in this process show a significant validity regarding the workplace environmental. This forming the base of preventive methods, the measures to be considered in the future in this work environmental. It was possible in this case to confirm the welding activity is clearly related to exposure to nanoparticles and heavy metals like manganese, chromium, and the others that have a health impact in the workers themselves. I think it's
okay.
I have a question for Maria Lurdes Dinis. In your slides, you refer to several studies that have been done about the radon exposure. I think there were. I'm not sure if they were related with lung cancer, but at some point you said that all of the studies that you presented had a linear relation where an increased exposure was related with an increased rate of incidence of, well, I think it was lung cancer. But suddenly you mentioned a study that shows that with very high levels of exposure, there was no association. Am I correct? I saw this I noticed here it was slide 12. Because you said it was linear, the relation between exposure and the health outcome, and suddenly you said, well, there's one study where with very high levels of exposure, there is no relation between exposure and outcome. Did you have any idea why this? Have you read the paper and found some hypotheses for this result?
I guess probably it has to do to other factors that interfere in the study of the exposure, because they are studies from different countries, probably different conditions, and the uncertainty from that result is evident because all the other studies, the relation was linear.
Yeah.
And that was the most important thing, because there are people that there are some researchers even that think that there is no risk below the 200 becquerel per cubic meter, but in fact even more and more each day the certain is higher that even the low dosing will have some risk of exposure. The problem is that when we are dealing with cancer, the latency period is quite wide. People that are exposed now will only present symptoms or effects many years after, so that it's quite difficult to establish a relationship cause effect with 100% certainty. I think that's the main cause, that uncertainty that is beside those studies, which is quite difficult to associate directly 100% that cause effect. Did I answer to your question? Because Manuel is frozen now.
Technical problems, Manuel.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
I think his connection was lost.
I think he didn't like the answer.
I don't know if
We'll probably
hear all your answer. So I don't know if he comes. I have a question also for you, Maria de Lourdes. Can you tell me what is being doing in Portugal about radion issues?
Yes, actually, there's a lot going on because with the transposition of the European directive in December 2018, it was established that the competent authority is in that radiological protection and the radiological issues is the APA, the Environment Portuguese Agency. And now they have a mission to implement the Radon Action Plan for the next 3 years, but I think one has gone now, so it's 2 years more. And they started a national campaign to measure or to assess the exposure at homes all over the country. And the Radon Action Plan will also include, and with that survey, a risk map will be built. And it also includes the building materials that may put some hazard, but mostly not concerns to gamma radiation exposure, but it's also considered. There's different issues to address in the Radon Action Plan, but there's a lot going on at the moment.
Okay, and also in the houses, only houses with basements have radon problems, and it is enough to ventilate the space, rooms. That is one of things we can do to lower the risk. But is enough?
Most people think that only basements, only confined space may present risk, but no. All houses may have some potential issues with radon. And another thing that is being undertaken through the Radon Action Plan is the building code for new houses that will include measures to mitigate or to avoid the radon problem. But many houses can have new houses, insulated houses with basements or without basements. It will depend on the place the house is built, on if they have on the construction materials also, and also in sometimes technical things that may if there is ventilation system underneath the building or not. There's a lot of things that can actually affect the radon entering into the houses, not just because it's a basement or not.
And do you know if there is some rules or guidelines, for example, for the radioactive geological materials that sometimes we use them in buildings materials?
It's being also addressed in the Radon Action Plan. At the moment, there's an inventory that is being developed by LENEC, working together with the APA. So this inventory will be finished, and after that the assessment of the potential for those materials to present some hazard in the exposure will be assessed. We are participating in that part, so we will be responsible for modeling several scenarios depending on the application of the building materials, if they are covered with some kind of finished material or not, if they are applied just like that. And we'll have to think about different scenarios that may after the application result in an exposure of higher doses that's supposed to be.
Right. It's not also important the characteristics of the material, but also the application, right?
Yes, it will be definitely. A material may be not suitable to be applied inside, but it may be suitable for the outside. Otherwise, we may be generating waste with the radiological potential, and then it will be another problem. So this must be studied and established that kind of application.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Manuel. You are unmute. Can you turn on your?
Yes. Hello. I'm sorry, Maria Lourdes. Got out of internet and now I'm in the cable reconnected, but I have to change place and I took a lot of time. I'm sorry for that, but now I'm back.
I don't know if you have more questions to Maria Lourdes or for Paula, because we don't have question for the audience.
No, I'm okay. I was just interested in understanding the hypothesis behind those strong differences in the results. Probably design study or something like that should be, or rather, if I wanted to know if she had any, if Maria Lourdes had any clue on what made that result so different from the knowledge scientific literature. Yeah, but that's all. Thank you.
Okay, I think I have one more question for you.
Okay. Yeah.
With COVID lockdown, air pollution decrease all over the world. Do you think this decrease will reduce some of disease caused by air pollution? For example, asthma, bronchitis. What do you think?
Well, I don't know, and I think it's an open question for now. It's everything occurring very rapidly, but probably if this situation of if new lockdowns occur, I hope, of course, we all hope that doesn't occur. But if we have more time of situations like that, longer periods, the probability that the reduction of some diseases like bronchitis and emphysema, all that are related with the ambient air pollution exposure, will probably see some decrease on that number, but because we are all living a new era with new data, and next few years will be very, very interesting in that point of view. Lots of new things that we'll learn from this occurrence, from this time that we are living, and that's one of the questions that will probably in few years some will be able to answer.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you have one comment from Maria João Colunas. She said, thank you to all the speakers and chair for this nice seminar. Okay, I think I don't have more questions for you. I think Susanna, you can close the section. Yes?
Yes.
So I just say it was a pleasure be here with all of you. Many thanks again for our speakers to share with us the contribution of SERENA researcher to the third sustainable development goal. Also thanks Susanna Moinhos for their support, and we hope see you in the next SERENA seminars or webinars. We don't know, in the next September or next year. Thank you for all. Thank you.
I would like also to thank you all and all the participants that we had on these SERENA seminars 2019-2020. We will be back. We don't know when, but we'll have SERENA seminars 2020-2021. Let's see in which kind of model and platform it will be. But thank you very much for all that were assisting on the YouTube channel, and we are being very I don't know.
Thank you.
On the YouTube channel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much
Thank
to
you
all,
very much.
all the ones that
Thank
participated.
you, Paula. Thank you,
Thanks.
Maria, and thank you.
Executive committee and everybody. Okay, bye bye. See you next.
Okay, bye
Bye
bye.
bye. See you next time.
Bye. See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.